Hello and welcome to today's the LaRouche organization webcast for Saturday, October 9th. We began with that quote from Abraham Lincoln: America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. Because we want to call attention to an event that occurred 35 years ago and resonates throughout the fabric of history globally today. People have been noticing, of course, the sort of rampant hyperinflation. No one could help but notice the pandemic, called the coronavirus pandemic, that is presently visiting the planet. There's also danger of wars and rumors of wars. In fact, the less reason we seem to have for the wars, the more wars seem to plague us. So the question is, what's happened? Why is it that all of the normal explanations for what would be going on don't seem to be working? Uh, the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, with whom about whom we're about to speak, uh, and here, used to talk about the idea of walking into your house and turning on the light, and the water starts running. And that's the sort of world that a lot of Americans and people all over the world feel that they're in. Well, 35 years ago, October 6, 1986, 400 federal, state, and local troops descended on Leesburg, Virginia, for the purpose of conducting an assassination of Lyndon LaRouche. He spoke about this and wrote about it. You see there a document called "The Night They Came to Kill Me." And the question is, why was it the case that Lyndon LaRouche would have had that kind of impact, that kind of significance, and why would that be arguably the beginning of the unraveling of a certain process of the United States of constitutional self-government, a process that would then have great disastrous implications for people all over the world? The way we're going to choose to begin to introduce this and discuss this, to introduce our major presentation, which will be given by Harley Schlanger, whom everybody will be speaking to and hearing from in a minute, is to let Lyndon LaRouche talk about a certain nemesis of his, George Herbert Walker Bush, and the George Bush, pre-presidency George Bush, who was responsible for Lyndon LaRouche going to jail. And this is from a discussion that he did in Houston, Texas, in 1996, 10 years after that October 6th raid.
I'll tell you the story. I don't know if you ever heard of it. You've ever heard of the angel who was called Simon the Bungler? Well, you should know about it, because this fellow is the angel who was downgraded for allowing Truman to drop the nuclear bombs on Japan in 1945, in August 1945. And so to punish him, they set him down to be the guardian angel of Texas. Now, after that experience, Simon was rather cautious. He didn't want to report upstairs. He wanted to keep away from the head office as much as possible for a while because of the mess he'd made. But as luck would have it, these Houston millionaires were setting up big prayers. And so he very reluctantly went up to the head office, and he talked to his old swordsmanship teacher, the Archangel Michael. And he said, "I hate to bother you, but I'm getting strong prayers with a lot of money behind them from Houston. And they're upset about this sequoia forest in California. They want us to give them a sequoia forest larger than that in California next to Houston." So the Archangel looked at Simon and said, "They get a couple of bushes." But let's take the Bush case. What happened that's convenient? You have the San Jose Mercury, daily newspaper, San Jose, did the series of stories exposing the fact, using government documents, court records, and so forth, exposing the fact that the Contras, George Bush's and Ollie North's Contras, were the people who brought crack cocaine through gangs like the Crips and Bloods in Los Angeles onto the streets in the United States. Now, I can tell you how it happened. As in the end of 1989, why did George Bush invade Panama? To get rid of the guy who was interfering with his drug pushers. Noriega, in order to put George Bush's partners, the Cali cartel, in control of Panama, which is exactly what he did. Now, what was George Bush's position? George, in 1982-83, was given special appointment under National Security Decision Directives 2 and 3. He was not only the czar for offshore war on drugs, which is how he got the drugs in. The El Paso station on planes was the control point on planes coming into the United States. And George Bush's planes got through because the pilots had the codes to respond to the El Paso state control station to get through. And they'd come straight in the United States, so they'd go north of Cuba, over to the Bahamas, or into Florida. And that's how the coke get in. Now, marijuana was coming in. But why did George bring in coke? He brought it in because he had it. And the people who brought in the coke had been the people who had been bringing in marijuana from Costa Rica. Colombian marijuana, largely from Costa Rica. These people were largely parachutists and pilots who were also part of this skydiver parachute operation, which is a special part of our government, a private act we do our government, which is called the knuckle draggers. It works under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And these are people who are assets, like intelligence assets, who can be hired and brought into an operation, who've been used again and again and again. These guys often would train, for example, the 82nd Airborne in parachuting and things like that as contractors. And they would do this kind of work, and then they would also be encouraged to do this little extra operation, special operation, knuckle dragger. U.S. wants somebody killed in little wars run in Central America someplace. These guys join up. This kind of thing. So these guys were operating with this kind of They had connections. And therefore they were able to bring in large amounts of marijuana with their little planes. And the operation targeted through places like Arkansas, up across Texas, through Arkansas, across the border, through Mexico, though that was partly a different operation, up to Minnesota, up to Illinois, also by way of Florida, or by the Bahamas in fast boats across the shallows into Florida by night. One day, George Bush got these guys with the aid of the U.S. government, and a fellow called F. Lee Bailey was also turned up in this business. And they said, okay, we got the goods on you. Now you're going to work for us. And so he said, you are now going to haul cocaine. Why'd they haul cocaine? Because George Bush had it. The cocaine was gotten from the Cali cartel and also Medellin. Not money, the cocaine itself. Though they may have gotten some cash here and there along the line. So suddenly you have George Bush, who's head of this organization, Don Gregg under him. Third level down is Oliver North, and a lot of other people. Ted Shackley from the Laos operation, the guy, the Bay of Pigs, Shackley, so forth. They're all together in this operation, working for George Bush. And George Bush has got a contra operation. He also has an operation, a gun-running operation in the Iraq-Iran war. He's running it together with the British. He also is involved in the war in Afghanistan, which is again a drug-financed war, largely drugs. There were Saudi contributions, other contributions, largely drugs. The British ran it, but the United States, through Bush, was involved in it. It was running all over the world, up to $1.5 to $1.7 trillion a year in the 80s in illegal or other kinds of arms traffic and drug traffic, which is what the heart of the international finances was. So George had himself a big hunk of cocaine, which is normally given to him to finance the contra operation. Well, what did he do? He dumped it on the street, undercutting the market, undercutting the existing cocaine distribution in the United States. How did he do that? Well, what he did is he took something that had been taken back from the streets called crack cocaine, and he unloaded crack cocaine into the ghettos. And therefore, we have maybe 100, maybe 200,000 people sitting in prison today who are doing Vice President George Bush's prison time.
What you just saw was from 25 years ago, but is it? Did you just see a potential explanation for the assassination of the president of Haiti? Did you just see an important background explanation for the origins of the war in Afghanistan? In other words, the problem with the personality of Lyndon LaRouche was he had this proclivity to tell the truth at inopportune moments in ways that people who had great power in the United States, in fact, would have even more power than after that 1996 speech you've just seen. He had the proclivity to tell the truth regardless of their power. It's called speaking truth to power. But there was a reason that he did this. During the period, particularly of the 1995-96 period, exactly when that was actually recorded, Lyndon LaRouche was also beginning a process of describing to people a fundamental shift in economy, the effects of which we are seeing play out right now, particularly in the recent weeks and months of 2021. And this is something that he also discussed at that same occasion.
The fact is in this country that if you measure in physical terms, not the funny money nonsense, but physical terms, that is, count the things which you had to have to maintain a family income, to reproduce, send some kids to school, college, so forth, that sort of thing, be reasonably healthy, own a home, all these kinds of things, and get through life and look forward to a pension retirement with some degree of comfort. That used to be normal. It was a normal aspiration of people who came out of World War II. Just to have that. And to have something, work they did, which they took pride in. And when they retired, take pride in the fact they'd had this skill and maybe pass it along to somebody. It's not true anymore. Not only has the per capita income, as income of employed persons, dropped to about half of what it was 25, 30 years ago. That is for most people. But the upper 10%, yes, they're richer. The upper 5% are fabulously rich, especially those that don't earn it. The less you do to earn money, the more you have. Right? It seems to be the way it goes. Right? So we're poor. Not only poor in terms of household income. How many incomes does it take in a household to try to approximate what was the standard income for a single plus wage earner back in the 1960s? Right? Two and a half. Right? 2.5 jobs in a household. To try to approximate what the income was, say, of a single wage earner in a family of someone who had some kind of skill or business back in the middle of the 1960s. We'll then look at other things. What about our infrastructure? Let's take, for example, here. How old are the aquifers, and how long ago should they have been fixed? What about the Oglala Aquifer? What has that got to do with resources in the future and the prosperity of the country? We could have fixed those. We didn't. What about the rail system? What about the power systems? Do we get enough power? We only get by because we're shutting down business. Therefore, we need less power community. The biggest factor in power consumption in the summer is air conditioners. Without the air conditioner strike, we wouldn't be using much power. And we're having fewer and fewer sources of power, fewer kilowatts capacity every year. Look at those little brownouts they had, those little blackouts they had in California. We're running up to the edge of limits of capacity. A slight strain will break it. What about agriculture? We don't produce enough food to feed the United States anymore. Oh, we produce some grain. Some of it you wouldn't want to feed the cattle, but we produce it. We export it. But we don't produce in leafy vegetables and other things. We are not producing in terms of cattle, in terms of meat. We're not producing enough. We are importing because the leverage we have under financial speculation, we're able to extract from Mexico leafy vegetables, from other parts of the world. We ship our employment, our jobs overseas, and we import what we need to live on. And we're able to get by with it only through a financial swindle. We do not have food security. Medical. Compare the terms of medical care in the 1960s to 1970. 1975, with what you have today. The doctors are being put out of the doctor business. They are now actually administrators controlled by a computer. They no longer treat the patient, they treat the diagnosed disease according to computer formula. If you're sick, that doesn't make any difference. You've been treated. Your disease has been treated. You know? You're thrown on the street. You know, because the president's making a silly laws he wants to make. Next thing you know, he'll try to pass a law that compels you to get faster service in the checkout line in a Safeway. It means it's bunk. But we are degenerating. We don't have, our school system is junk. How do they get by with saying children are doing better in school? The schools become poorer. They test whatever they want to do. You know why you don't have a depression in the United States? Because they changed the meaning of the word. They now call depression prosperity or growth. The growth of poverty is a growth, isn't it not? Look, it's all fake. There's no truth to it. We also, on a global scale, look at disease. Look at the parts of the world that are blowing up. This is insane. We cannot go on this way. We cannot continue to go in the direction we've been drifting for the past 30 years. We've got to change. And we've got to get a government that will change this. But these baby boomers know they're politically correct. So we've got to stir something up. You've got to, in a sense, make a revolution. But the revolutions are, not glorious things. They're very simple things.
And that is exactly why we've met here today, because what you just heard him describe could of course describe right now. It does describe right now. Why does it describe right now? That was a quarter century ago, 25 years ago. The reason that it describes right now is that despite the presidencies, or maybe in fact because of the presidencies that intervened, the situation worsened year by year, presidency by presidency, congressional session by congressional session. We've now reached the point where the impoverishment of America is so great, and still not admitted, that we can lose 700,000 citizens, maybe even up to 1 million by the time that we get to the end of the year. Hopefully not. There seems to be some attenuation of the death rates around COVID in particular. But we could lose that many, and yet we'll say, well, that's not because of poverty. That's because of a disease. It's not because we're closing hospitals. It's not because we no longer have our own capabilities producing industry-wide and agriculturally for the livelihood of more and more Americans. It's because of some other reason. We can't see the reason. But Lyndon LaRouche could see the reason. In fact, what he did at that time was he produced a set of illustrations which he referred to as the triple curve. And let's just go to that. This is LaRouche, and when he first premiered the triple curve, which was in 1995, about a year before what you've just seen. Next, please. This is the position that our nation reached about 4 or 5 years ago, a little bit more actually than that, when what has occurred is that the rate of hyperinflation, which is what you're now experiencing, which is what you see in the two top curves. You see the red curve is called financial aggregates. That would be things like derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, the old mortgage-backed securities back, of course, from some years back. But you see that this green line overtakes the pink line. And this is what you're experiencing in terms of hyperinflation today. The fact that, for example, the price of shipping a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles has doubled in the last year. You're up to $20,000 or something like that for containers. And it will be a lot more, perhaps by the end of this program. And so what the bottom yellow curve represents is our actual physical economic input and output. For example, when last year we deployed something like $6 trillion plus to bail out the banking, and then gave about $1 to $2 trillion out to people, which was probably necessary at that moment to maintain them. How many trillions of dollars went into plant and equipment? went into what's called infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the highways, tunnels, dams. Hmm? Uh, what about our energy supplies? How about the fact that we're closing nuclear power plants? We had 112 of them in the United States about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. We now have 92. And still people talk about the idea of reducing a carbon footprint, but nuclear power never comes up. We've reached this point, and let's go to the next one, please, where now what we begin to experience is this. In other words, if you think about what you saw in the previous illustration, what has occurred is that we've now reached an impasse in which a shock front occurs. That's where you see with a dotted line. You get a point of meta instability in which everything begins to fall apart. It seems to suddenly disintegrate. But it's actually a process that had been going on from 1966 up until the point that you saw what Mr. LaRouche was talking about, which was 1996, 30 years, and then for 25 years after. Just this past week, what happened was that Vladimir Putin was making some remarks, and these were directed at the European Union, and they were and the various problems that Russia has been encountering, particularly, for example, in getting the permits for its Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But there were many other things that Vladimir Putin addressed. And what he talked about was what were people thinking about heating their homes with and powering industry with in the way of energy in places like Germany, where out of 17 nuclear power plants they once had, they've killed 11 of those plants, not just shut them, but killed them. They're inoperable. And they've got another 6, and they're talking about closing another 3. They've got these windmills, but what's actually happened is that they've increased their use of coal, so that the use of coal is approximately double that of Russia. Yet Russia gets criticized. China, of course, gets criticized because it's the world's largest consumer of coal and also producer of coal. And all of this talk about climate change goes on, which we're not going to go into right now. But there was a very specific importance to what Vladimir Putin had to say. It was an article that appeared this past week in the London Guardian, which referenced Russia's experience with attempting to implement the kind of crazy monetary policies that presently dominate the European Union and the crazy Green New Deal policy that is being attempted by the present Biden administration, along with many other administrations around the world, what is called financial regime change. I'm going to refer to what that article says. It said that during the 1990s, Russia suffered an economic catastrophe with the equivalent of $20 to $25 billion leaving the country every year, and the gross domestic product falling nearly 40% between 1991 and 1998. Now, let's note that that is the period in which the Soviet Union disappeared, and then Russia, was there by itself. And at that point, Boris Yeltsin came to power, and what happened was that it opened up completely to the West, and something called shock therapy started. And there was Jeffrey Sachs, and there was Robert Strauss, and there was the idea that Russia was going to now become the new frontier to prove how radical economic reform and market economy and capitalism could somehow create the greatest success story since the beginning of capitalism. That was the idea. But instead, what happened was that the Soviet Union, which had the second largest economy on earth, today, this year, thanks only to a reliance on Soviet-era fossil fuels and arms export industry, Russia hovers just outside the top 10 in total economic output, ranking below Italy and India, but still manages only 78th place below Romania in per capita GDP. I just want to continue one last part. This is after that. The failures of the Russian transition can be chalked to, go to the next one, please, chalked to the collapse of empire, decades of economic decay, the vengeful triumphalism of the West, the unchecked venality of local opportunists, or all of the above. It would be a mistake, however, to dismiss such a cautionary tale as a mere historic peculiarity. If we're not careful, the Russian past could well become humanity's future, a transition bungled, a golden opportunity squandered. What we want to do is to give you the opportunity to think through what this so-called transition that the London Guardian is referring to. They're referring to the idea of the Green New Deal. But the LaRouche organization and its co-thinker organizations is referring to something very different than that. There is a transition, and there's a transition from an order that has completely collapsed and isn't going to come back to something that will be new. But the question is, can we, the American people, as well as people all over the world, change what appears to be the doomed destiny of the collapse of this system in favor of something else that's not only on the horizon, but is actually there and available for us to take part in worldwide. And here to discuss both that, the LaRouche organization's policies for how to avoid this doomed destiny, and how you can be involved with us in that is Harley Schlanger. So Harley, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Dennis. And as you just heard from Dennis's presentation, we're being hit with a dizzying array of events, which is enough to make the heads of even sober people spin. We have a systemic breakdown. There's no other way to look at it. You can try to look at different sectors and what's happening here and there, but if you take it in its totality, what's clear is we're in what Lyndon LaRouche described as a systemic breakdown. On the economy, we're seeing inflation. There are energy shortages, supply chain breakdowns. Secondly, we have the collapse of infrastructure. Energy is one area, and this is not just collapsing, it's being deliberately collapsed as part of the Green New Deal, the idea that the climate is changing for the worse because we can produce enough electricity to take care of 8 billion people on the planet. Roads don't function, the bridges are breaking down. The medical public health sector has been so badly damaged that it was exposed very clearly with the COVID pandemic that we didn't have enough adequate health care to take care of the people. It's all breaking down. Then you have on top of that the war danger. You have just one example, and I won't go through all of this, but the Wall Street Journal had a report the last couple of days saying that the United States has sent about 24 special forces to train military layers in Taiwan. Now, this was reported right after Joe Biden and Xi Jinping had a conversation in which Biden reaffirmed the traditional policy of the US toward China, toward Taiwan, which is there's one China, and Taiwan is a part of that. Well, why are we putting military people in Taiwan if we recognize that's part of China? Suppose we heard that the Chinese People's Liberation Army was training units in Texas or in Washington state. So one day Biden reaffirms the one China policy, and then we hear that we're actually preparing a regime change with military forces there. And of course, the Chinese are rightfully concerned and pointing out that this is, in a sense, an invasion. I would simply add, one should just look at the effects of the special force deployments around the world and realize that maybe China shouldn't be so worried. But you have AUKUS, the US, Australian, United Kingdom military pact, Asian NATO, the pivot to Asia. All of this is a pre-war based on the idea that somehow we can contain the second largest economy and the largest population center on the earth through military forces in the Pacific. We have, when Dennis was talking about the moral and intellectual problem, depraved indifference. The United States is conducting policies that are killing children in Syria, in Yemen. The World Food Program is reporting that 4 million Afghan children could starve to death this winter. Where is the outcry about this? Why are we not moving to rally forces and move goods that are necessary to protect people? Not to mention Haiti, which is not too far from the United States, where we're turning our back on that country that's been devastated by natural disasters, and outside interference. Then you have the spectacle of the US Congress pretending to deal with problems. And I won't even get into that, but the infrastructure bill is an abomination. It will actually worsen infrastructure in the United States by emphasizing green policy. My big question is the Republicans who are supposedly so anti-green, where are their voices? We know Donald Trump moved to pull the United States out of the Paris conference, the Paris Accord. There's another conference coming up starting in 3 weeks in Glasgow, Scotland. Where are the Republican voices, the supposed defenders of American economy, speaking out against that? And then finally, we have massive disinformation. We have narratives that are being produced, censorship. We now hear that Google is moving to limit what can be said on its platforms about climate change. Soon they will be censoring anyone who argues that the science behind climate change is a fraud. Now, all of this, what we've just been talking about, is a prelude to the next phase of the destruction of the Western economies, which is announced in a book by Klaus Schwab, the director of the World Economic Forum, the Davos Group. Schwab has a book called Stakeholder Capitalism, a global economy that works for progress, people, and planet. The title itself is a typical lie, but here's just one comment, one quote that gives you a sense of what Davos is working for with the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. He attacks the idea of infrastructure building in Ethiopia. And he says, this reveals the central conundrum of the combat against climate change. The same force that helps people escape from poverty and lead a decent life is the one that is destroying the livability of our planet for future generations. The emissions that lead to climate change are not just the result of a selfish generation of industrialists or Western baby boomers. Schwab writes, they are the consequence of the desire to create a better future for oneself. Now, he's arguing that the attempt of people in poor countries or even in richer countries to provide a better future is what's dooming the planet. That's the kind of fake scholarship that actually is nothing more than lies to defend what we should call correctly a fascist depopulation policy. And his whole stakeholder capitalism matters, or metrics rather, are going to be used to determine whether any enterprise, a factory, a farm, a household, a school, is deserving of credit based on its green footprint. Now, in a discussion the other day, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, in referring to this, made a very important comment for what I intend to cover in the rest of my presentation today. She said, this is fascism, no less than it was with the Nazis. The present green policy is madness. It is fascism with a green face. It will lead to catastrophic results if it's not reversed. And she concluded that section of her comments by saying, and we must say it out loud in public. Now, this is something that has always been the policy of the LaRouche movement, to tell the truth, to speak boldly. We put a Hitler mustache on Obama to describe his medical, his so-called Obamacare, which was designed to limit care, not to give people more care. LaRouche is called an extremist for these things. Long before anyone looked at the Trump or MAGA and called them extremists, LaRouche was identified as an extremist in the 70s. And we're going to look at this process, why it was that Lyndon LaRouche was singled out as a target of this network. Now, before I go on, I should just make this point, though. There's tremendous resistance to this from the American people, from people in Europe, from people in the developing sector, and especially from important countries like Russia, China, and India. Speaking for the poorer countries, the Indian energy minister said, people want development. You can't take that away from us. Schwab, in a sense, was echoing what Greta Thunberg said in a recent conference in Milan, where she said that the cause of the problem today was the Industrial Revolution. we need to go back before the Industrial Revolution. Well, they're less than, actually, I think less than 1 billion people on the planet then. Maybe, I don't have the exact figures for that. But they are talking about massive population reduction, and they're going about it through a top-down fascist reorganization. So the idea that LaRouche is extreme, no. He's precise, and he's been prescient. Now, the work of Schwab and others is defensive, and that's something people have to realize. They think these are such powerful forces, but they're in a desperate drive to reinforce what they call the rules-based order, a unipolar system where the policies can be made in the City of London, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley and imposed on a reluctant population. Now, this system goes back, as Dennis was saying, to the mid-60s. I'm going to take it from a 50-year arc from 1971. And we're going to take a look at a special segment of that arc, the 15 years between 1971 to 1986, to see the pivotal importance of the leading opposition figure to that transformation, that negative transformation. That leading opposition figure was Lyndon LaRouche. And to his death, he continued in that position. And today, the LaRouche organization represents that leading opposition worldwide. The attempt to stop the consolidation of this global fascist empire. So last week was the 35th anniversary of the Great Leesburg Raid. This was something which I think people would be shocked if to read about it today, because many were shocked by the heavy-handed policy of the FBI against Roger Stone, the storming of his house, 26 to 30 armed FBI agents, news cameras, 6 in the morning, disturbing the neighborhood, his wife, his family. And for what? For a lie that was concocted by Robert Mueller. Now, that was considered heavy-handed. What happened on October 6th, 1986 was much more heavy-handed. There were 400 officials, law enforcement, FBI, state and local police. There was a helicopter flying overhead. There were jeeps. There were armed personnel carriers. There may have been some tanks. This was the Get LaRouche Task Force that was organized by leading oligarchs in the United States. John Train, a Wall Street financier, working with people like Henry Kissinger, working with the FBI, under the direction of William Weld, who later became the governor of Massachusetts and drafted the original bill which became Obamacare. And one of the operatives of the Get LaRouche Task Force who ran the case against Lyndon LaRouche in Boston was none other than Robert Mueller. Now, LaRouche explains why this happened. And I want the first post to go up to give you a sense of how LaRouche described this. You saw earlier the article, "The Night They Came to Kill Me." What Lyndon LaRouche said in this article is that there were 3 tightly linked policies, or issues rather, that were the reason behind the efforts to silence him. The main reason, he said, is my fight against the effort of certain liberal economists to put the world as a whole under the thumb of policies of former Nazi economics minister Hjalmar Schacht. And you'll hear more about Schacht in a moment. The 3 issues LaRouche identified are: 1, my pro-Franklin Roosevelt opposition to Schachtian economics, which today is the stakeholder capitalism of Schwab and the Davos crowd. 2, my opposition to the so-called utopian military doctrines associated with Beast Man Dick Cheney. That should be Beast Man, not Best Man Dick Cheney. This we've seen with the regime change wars, the effort to use shock and awe to destroy countries, to force them to abide by the agreements of the unipolar order. And 3rd, he said, my intention to reverse the folly of the past 40 years downward drift of the USA from the world's leading producer nation to today's predatory mess of Roman Empire-style post-industrial bread and circuses. Now, The period leading up to this 1986 raid, LaRouche was very prominent, going back to his election eve broadcast in 1976, where he identified Jimmy Carter as a puppet of the Trilateral Commission and went after the policies which we now know today through Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, provoked the Russians to invade Afghanistan that began the 40-year endless war against the people of Afghanistan. But he was also, became very well known for his expose of the Trilateral Commission, of the 1980s project, which included Paul Volcker, George Shultz, and others, who were committed to what they called the controlled disintegration of the Western economies. That's been unfolding since the Carter administration. LaRouche also played a leading role in identifying counter-terror problems, the deployment of terrorists by NATO, by the CIA, Operation Gladio, that was tearing apart Europe in the 1980s. In 1986, when Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, was assassinated, NBC News and the Anti-Defamation League tried to say that Lyndon LaRouche was behind it. And it later was discovered that that line came from the East German communist Stasi intelligence. And yet it was all over the United States media that LaRouche and his associates were responsible for the Palme assassination. Also in March 1986 was an election in Illinois in which two LaRouche associates won statewide nomination to Democratic Party candidacies for lieutenant governor and attorney general. And there was evidence from pollsters that the LaRouche movement was gaining strength all throughout the United States. Now, it was at that moment that the raid was conducted. But again, we have to go back further to see why LaRouche was such a threat. And I want to give you a chance to take a look at what Lyndon LaRouche did in a very famous debate with an economist named Abba Lerner, who was a left liberal, maybe social democrat, who was considered to be adequate to counter Lyndon LaRouche on behalf of a group of economists who were threatened by LaRouche's growing hegemony on college campuses. The reason LaRouche was gaining this hegemony was because he had forecast what no one else did. That is, that there was a breakdown of the Western system, of the Bretton Woods system, and he forecast that it was going to be, that there would be a break with that, which occurred on August 15th, 1971, when Nixon was convinced to take the dollar off gold reserve and establish a floating exchange system, which we've had to the present day. Lerner was a prominent liberal who was put up to counter LaRouche. And I want you to look at this video excerpt to get a sense of what they were discussing, because what LaRouche he starts with is explaining why Lerner's approach, which is the approach of the neoliberals today, will ultimately lead to fascism.
The trouble with heat, which Professor Lerner doesn't seem to grasp, is that in the ordinary course of events, economic teaching in universities is more like the practice of a priesthood than anything to do with reality. It's simply something you learn, you don't use it in business much. Point of fact, most business economists or most practicing economics in business do not have an economics training, but usually in industrial engineering or some other type of training. However, in the course of a crisis, these abstractions, which are the priestly affairs of economic education, which you have to learn to pass the course primarily, become something more than abstractions. They become something relating to concrete policies which affect the lives of people. And they have consequences for people. And thus people who are too divorced from reality, seeing these abstractions merely as innocent intellectual toys, lack a grasp of the blood concreteness that these abstractions sometimes lead to in practice. And therefore, since the lives and well-beings of millions and even billions of people are at stake, that an error in the domain of abstraction is not an intellectual error. It can be a bloody crime against humanity. A professor who says innocently The economy, from my point of view, would be better organized if certain administrative arrangements were made. Does not necessarily think out to the kind of administrative arrangements which in practice realize that very innocent practice. Professor Lerner may attempt to divorce his economic policies from the policies of the government of Brazil and see them in abstraction and detachment from that. However, you cannot carry out the economic policies which are recommended for Brazil without having the kind of government which makes those economic policies work. You could not have the kind of policies which are recommended, which he's recommended as a classic austerity policy for increased unemployment. Now, it is classic in the sense that this is precisely the policy of Schacht from 1933 on in Germany, in which wages were frozen to prevent the inflation and in order to increase employment. He may personally detach himself from that, but it's not possible for the politicians to accept his advice to detach themselves from the kind of government and the kind of procedures which enable those abstractions to become reality. And that has to be grasped, because now no longer is economics merely a plaything of an obscure corner of the academic priesthood. Now economic policy is that which determines the lives and daily lives and conditions of people. The form of economic policy determines the kind of government which is necessary to carry it out. And the only kind of government which can carry out the kind of policy which Professor Lerner recommends in all well-meaning, all good intention, would have to be a Bonapartist or fascist government.
Bonapartist or fascist government. What's he referring to? The kinds of economic reforms that Lerner was talking about, that today Schwab and the Davos billionaires and the Mark Carneys and the Finks of BlackRock are talking about, can only be implemented under a global central banker's dictatorship, in which power is taken away from sovereign governments, from nation states, from elected representatives, and put in the hands of technocrats, the same way that Milton Friedman and George Shultz did to the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. They used a military dictatorship to impose the austerity that they said was necessary to save the economy. In other words, kill people with fascist policies to save the economy? No, to save the corporate cartels. Schacht was a product of the corporate cartels and the trusts that came into existence after World War I and after the Versailles Agreement. These were corporations that included leading US, British, and German corporations in steel, in rubber, in energy, in banking. They chose Schacht as their representative. He was specifically chosen by Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England. And funding went to the German cartels from an American bank, the Union Bank Corporation of New York, which had two very prominent American board members, Roland Harriman of the Harriman family, and Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George W. Bush and the father of George Herbert Walker Bush. These were the forces that worked together to put Schacht in the Hitler government. And it was Schacht who, as Lynn was saying, in order to enact these economic policies, came up with a strategy of working people to death in the concentration camps. So that before there were mass killings in the concentration camps, they were starving people to death, working them to death on behalf of these international corporate cartels. Confirming LaRouche's statement on this was Lerner himself, who at the end of the debate said, if Germany had accepted Schacht's policies, Hitler would not have been necessary. Listen to that again. If Germany had accepted Schacht's policies, Hitler would not have been necessary. If you will accept the Green New Deal and the Great Reset, then we won't need jackboots to force you to do it. But that's where we're headed. These policies, the Bonapartist Schachtian policies in the Green New Deal and the Great Reset, are not there, as Klaus Schwab so kindly said, to, what were his comments, to improve to lead people from poverty and so on, to create a better world. They're designed to defend the corporate cartels especially in banking and finance, but also insurance, raw material cartels, food cartels, big pharma. The tools they've been using: deregulation and free trade, quantitative easing to make the banks give them the money to roll over the debt that's unsustainable, even as they shut down their factories. These are radical free market policies of the sort that were being discussed at that time when Nixon moved to pull the plug on the Bretton Woods system. The super profits for the corporations depend on reducing the power of governments, so governments can't regulate, so that the sovereign nations can't defend their populations or their productive systems, but it's in the hands of the corporate cartels through international courts and agreements, so that you as a citizen have no recourse to do anything. And if the Great Reset goes through, economic policy, including spending, not just credit and financing, but spending policy, will no longer be in the hands of elected representatives, but in the hands of technocrats working for the private banks. Now, having seen the recent fiasco around the budget discussion and the debt ceiling in the United States, you might say, well, that's good. We don't need the Congress to do that. We do need the Congress to do it, but we need a better Congress. If you take that away from elected representatives, as Schwab is proposing, as Lynn said Lerner's policies would require, then you take away the power of people to protect and defend the general welfare, which is the preamble of our Constitution. The result of Shaktian policies on a worldwide basis, through the implementation of massive austerity, including energy austerity, would be mass depopulation, precisely as advocated in 1975 in Henry Kissinger's National Security Study Memo 200, which Lyndon LaRouche made a big issue about. Precisely as the International Monetary Fund has demanded throughout the last 50 years, which we've fought every single opportunity. So when we're looking at this fight, it's not adequate to be roped in to the traditional profiles of left versus right, socialist versus capitalist, free market versus government. Those are designed to manipulate the suckers to get into a fight that cannot be won. And while you're fighting, the policy of global depopulation is marching ahead. I'll give you one simple example. Remember in 2009, 2010, the debate over Obama's medical policy, the Obamacare policy. There were two complementary processes underway. On the one side, the Tea Party, which was opposed to the bailout, and Occupy Wall Street, which was opposed to the bailout after the 2008 crash. Both of those tendencies had common interest in stopping the control of corporations over government policy. And yet, the Tea Party called itself right and made a commitment to cutting taxes as the first priority, whereas Occupy Wall Street never really had a coherent strategy. And so instead of coming together as a force with a program, which would have been LaRouche's program of putting the banks through bankruptcy reorganization, restoring Glass-Steagall banking separation, of investing, having an infrastructure program based on a national banking system, making credit available for the physical economy for real production rather than for bailouts. Instead, they fought impotent battles, and we ended up with a Congress that has gotten more and more degenerate each sitting. Now, it's through the corporate cartels running the governments that we see this policy carried out. And this is the British imperial system, the attempt to move us from an American presidential system into something in which parties controlled by special interests determine the policy. And whoever you vote for doesn't matter because it's coming down from higher up. And that's what Schwab and Mark Carney and these people are trying to push through. And their only problem is how to get people to accept these policies. Well, our suggestion is, and the reason we went through this tonight or today, is for people to take a look at LaRouche as a figure who was universally reviled by the enemies of America and the American system, who was set up for being killed 35 years ago on October 6, 1986, because he was growing in stature as an international figure. And our movement was growing, our solutions were catching on. Today, the proposals that we were making in the 80s and 90s have become the center of international fight. The Belt and Road Initiative, nuclear energy as opposed to green and environmentalism. These are the battles we were waging. And today, global development is at the center of this. Now, some people try to characterize LaRouche as someone who is an American first figure, similar to what some people characterize Donald Trump as. Lyndon LaRouche was never for America first. He was saying that the American Revolution is a model for a global reconstruction, and that the moral test of America is, do we carry out our revolutionary tradition to decolonize the world, to give every child of every nation the opportunity that we give to our cherished American children. And that means a modern healthcare system. It means energy production. It means full set infrastructure and machine tool development based on science and technology so that we can increase the productivity of every single worker. That's how you reverse the triple curve collapse, by increasing the productivity, by investing not in worthless financial instruments, hoping to make some extra bucks, but in which we have a credit policy which goes into the physical economy and into the development of our population for the future. That means a new financial system, a new Bretton Woods. And that's how we solve the problems in the United States. There is a growing awareness that something has to be done, but it needs to be attached to a serious program. That Lyndon LaRouche's program has been the most serious and potentially effective developed in the last 50 years is attested to by the extent to which he was attacked. He was the original target of cancel culture. Rosenthal, a writer for the Washington Post, I believe it was in 1978, wrote an editorial saying no journal should ever, no newspaper should ever mention the name Lyndon LaRouche unless you're going to attack him. This is a perfect example of what we face. And yet his ideas have taken hold throughout the world. And I would urge you to, in thinking this through, go to our website and study some of these reports, look at some of the videos, read some of the articles like The Night They Came to Kill Me, to get a sense of what kind of an American Lyndon LaRouche was. And then to join with us, with the LaRouche organization, to carry out LaRouche's program for the future of our country and the future of the world. So that's my report for today.
Thanks a lot, Harley. I've already gotten in several questions, but I want to do is we don't seem to have a graphic of this. I just want to show people, if we can see it, that yes, that isn't too bad. The coming U.S. economic miracle on the new Silk Road. Yes, this is the pamphlet that we're getting out, and we want this reproduced massively in the United States. You may say, well, people are, physical pamphlets, that's not so good. Well, actually, if you try to go on the internet and talk about various topics right now, you don't seem to be finding too much of a friendly reception. Luckily, some of us who had never abandoned the printed word realize that it's often a lot of the time very important to be able to compile for people something they can put in their hand and that they can study, which is why we prepared this. It has 14 different sections, which discuss several questions. For example, conquering inflation and depression with Glass-Steagall and development. Actually, we got a few questions, two questions on that topic. It goes through what is an infrastructure platform, what is a development corridor, and it has a series of documents intended to allow for the idea of the LaRouche Four Laws that you heard from Harley to really be sort of discussed, read, studied, questioned. And it's this process that we are looking to promote in the United States. Also, let me point out, it says the coming U.S. economic miracle on the new Silk Road. And that refers to, of course, what China is doing in what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, which now involves over 150 nations and about 2/3 of humanity. This is something that the United States should have been jumped on right away. Matter of fact, the United States should never have abandoned its industrialization, which it more or less did 50 years ago, partially prompted, in fact, by this silliness of what was called back then environmentalism, which prevented nuclear power from being advanced, the very same nuclear power that would have eventually rendered fossil fuels essentially obsolete. You would have had no reason for them. In fact, the idea, if you really wanted to do anything about coal or oil or whatever, you would do precisely the opposite of what we're doing right now. You'd have a crash program of perhaps 15, 20 years duration to develop a nuclear fission and fusion. But in that context, you would want to use as much of what you had in fossil fuels to prompt that. And no problem to do a crash program like that. If you just think about it the way that the Apollo project worked, it'd be pretty obvious why that would work. If you think about, like, say, a 3-stage rocket, a booster rocket, you would use the oil and gas and coal capabilities as a kind of booster. But what you're actually doing is you're factoring in and you're weaving in nuclear power capabilities, both in terms of fission and fusion, as you go along. And so if you just look at that, this is the sort of thing that our document is intended to create as a discussion. So let me just ask you, Harley, this is sort of two questions in one. Let me just get it here. And it was, how can the hyperinflation be stopped by using the four laws of LaRouche? And the person, there's sort of a question, what's the difference between hyperinflation and austerity? How are they the same or are they different? So that's basically the questions.
All right, well, the way you stop hyperinflation is you stop printing money to bail out worthless instruments. I mean, the hyperinflation is not caused because we're running out of coal and oil. You take the energy situation, for example. There's hardly, I think something like 40% of the gas stations in the United Kingdom have been shut down because there's no gasoline available. You have nitrogen prices skyrocketing. You have all across Europe, the energy costs are going up. It's not because we've run out of oil or natural gas or nuclear power or coal. It's because there's a policy to stop using these. And as a result, you have shortages that are artificially created. But that's only part of the story. The real hyperinflation comes from the bailout of worthless corporations and financial instruments. Almost between 40 and 45% of corporate debt from 2018 to 2020, and I haven't seen the more recent figures, but in that period, 2018 to 2020, close to 50% of corporate debt was issued at the level of junk bond or just below junk bond status. In other words, they offered high interest rates because they needed cash. And where did they get the cash? From the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve made money available to banks through quantitative easing, and the banks made the money available to companies that should have been put through bankruptcy. So you stop hyperinflation by stop printing the money and putting through an organized bankruptcy process, a bankruptcy reorganization of firms that are bankrupt. These are called zombie corporations. That's a technical term because they don't make enough profit to cover the interest on their debt. Now, in September of 2019, this became a systemic crisis. And what the Federal Reserve did is increase the lending through what's called the repurchasing agreements or the repo lending. And initially it was $20 billion a night, then 30, then 40. It was up to 150 billion a night. Now, what are these overnight loans? It's a company that has to make a payment in the morning and can't do it. So they give some of the financial instruments they're holding, or bonds or corporate debt, to a bank in return for cash to pay down their immediate payment. And then they buy it back the next day from the Federal Reserve or whatever. How do they buy it back? Quantitative easing. Now, we're seeing a different process in China right now, and there's a freak out on Wall Street about this. It's the Evergrande case. Now, China has had some companies that moved into speculation, similar to the United States, and they're not able to pay their debt. So what the Chinese government has said is that they're going to reorganize the debt as to different tranches, different priorities. One priority, which is the Chinese homeowners who gave contracts with Evergrande to buy homes, they'll be protected. But the speculators will not be protected. The government will not bail out the speculative debt. This is what Lyndon LaRouche proposed in 2007, 2008. In July 2007, he warned that we were headed toward a banking collapse based on the mortgage-backed securities, the huge increase in prices for homes, and so on. And that blew up in 2008. At that point, Lyndon LaRouche said, we need a bankruptcy reorganization, not a bailout. And he proposed something called the Homeowner and Bank Protection Act, in which the commercial banks would be protected because these are banks where people have their deposits, their savings, their business accounts. But the investment banks will not be protected. And if they have bad investments, they have to either write them down in the long term or eat the losses. In other words, no bailout. That's how you squeeze out the hyperinflation. You cancel the bad debt, or you work out that it will be a period of 2 to 5 years. They'll be able to keep it on their books in the process of reorganizing their company to become capable of paying it back in the future. That's what was done with Glass-Steagall and Franklin Roosevelt after the Pecora Commission exposed the extent to which speculative bankers were swindling people through their control over utility companies and other kinds of companies and charging outlandish rates and driving the whole country into bankruptcy. Instead, what Franklin Roosevelt said is you have a separation between these institutions, and we protect the families, we protect the homeowners, we protect the commercial banks, which are a source of lending to businesses in the community, but we don't protect speculation. That's what I would say is the way you deal with hyperinflation. Now, the relationship between hyperinflation and austerity is that the standard argument is, well, when inflation goes up, the problem is it becomes self-fulfilling because there's a pressure to increase wages, and then so that people can afford to buy things. And when you increase wages, it increases hyperinflation. That's backwards. That's blaming the consumer trying to stay alive or the productive worker trying to stay alive for the effect of the bankers. The bankers demand austerity because they're saying we don't want the government to be funding programs. We don't want money diverted from the bailouts into programs that will produce real wealth. And so the connection of hyperinflation and austerity is that the bankers will use hyperinflation to shut down government and government operations and punish people, as opposed to having proper regulatory actions taken against the speculators, who in many cases, it turns out they're breaking the law. And look, we just had a perfect example of this. The case of Kaplan at the Dallas Federal Reserve and Rosengren at the Boston Federal Reserve. Two people who are branch presidents of the Federal Reserve Bank who were speculating in financial instruments that are supposedly regulated by these Federal Reserve banks. And not, this should have been a huge scandal. The two of them were forced to resign, but no one's brought this up in the context of the problem of hyperinflation and the collapse of the economy.
Okay, and we do now have a graphic of the pamphlet, if we can put that up so people can see it again. The Coming U.S. Economic Miracle on the New Silk Road. So if we can get that up. And while we're getting the graphic up, Harley, I'll ask you the next question so you can begin to think about it. And the question is, why do Schwab and the World Economic Forum of Davos need the deal to run their bank bailout?
Okay, well, the fear that they have is that under pressure from citizens, legislatures will act against the speculative swindles and will be uh, responsible. That the governments will say, look, we're not going to let you do this. This goes against the welfare of our country. It goes against the potential productivity which is needed to get out of the crisis. Now, Schwab and the people at Davos know that. They've studied this for years. George Shultz wrote a book about this. Walt Wriston wrote a book about this. Wriston's book is titled The Twilight of Sovereignty, Why Economic Sovereignty is the Problem. And what's his main argument? Because sovereign nations at times are under pressure from their populations to act in the interests of their people as opposed to the interests of global corporations. So this, and Wriston's book, I think, was written in the early 90s. So this problem was seen a long time ago. It was part of the whole discussion around the establishment of the World Trade Organization. If you set up global institutions for trade without tariffs, without the ability of countries to protect their production and their consumption, what happens when people start protesting? For example, when corporations are engaging in shady practices, but these are legal and international rules, even if they violate laws in a country. The country no longer has the sovereign right to bring a legal case against that bank or financial institution or corporation. So what Schwab and others are basically saying is representative government, that is the idea of a republic, is the threat to a global cartel, which is actually the replacement government, what some people call the New World Economic Order, what George Bush Sr. called the New World Economic Order, was this global corporate cartel arrangement in which nations no longer have the power to act to protect their own people. The American Revolution was made against this. A big part of the fight that unified activists throughout the American colonies was the unfair trade practices being launched by the British to keep the Americans from being able to manufacture. And so one of the most important issues for Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, was protective tariffs, not to punish other countries, but to protect industries so they could develop in the United States. And it was an effective policy, and it's still effective today. So what Schwab and others recognize is that in a globalized world, the beneficiaries are a small group at the top, and the rest of the world is essentially treated as peasants with no rights. And if you take away the power of nations to defend those peasants, then you have no problem enforcing the laws. That's what the rules-based order is. That's what the American military is being called on to defend by attacking countries like Iraq and Libya and Syria, countries that were actually developing, but were developing in a way that was moving away from the existing institutions of international finance.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Well, there's several questions. Let me see how I'm going to do this. Well, also, do we now have the graphic and can we show it so people see? Very nice. Coming U.S. economic miracle on the New Silk Road. And we are asking that the pamphlet is not being sold. Pamphlet is we're giving it away, but we want contributions to help us get that out. We've printed only something under 10,000 initially, but the idea is to get those to organizers, and then the organizers begin to get it out. Sort of those who want to do a kind of opposition and protest against the internet might consider to contribute to get that pamphlet out, and think about it as a movement. We'll call it Black Print Matters, right? Instead of you just going to the internet. Okay, yeah, black print. Let's go to that, right? And try using that. So let's see. We have a question. Just give me a minute here, Harley. I'm trying to. Okay, I've got it. Is this: can you talk about the character assassination that has happened with Lynn and his organization? One of the things that happens when I meet someone and tell them about our organization, they always say, "Wow, this is great. Why isn't this organization known more?" Then a few Google searches later, they mention to me the slanders that are there. And then how has the organization been able to be above the slanders and continue to be effective and thrive despite the attempts to ruin our image? I think what's not added here is once people do a couple Google searches, they say, maybe see you later." But perhaps I'm reading too much into that. So that's the question anyway.
Well, that's the question every organizer has to confront when they decide they're going to support the LaRouche movement, because we have been a target for precisely the reasons Lynn identified, the three tightly related issues that he identified. He pronounced at the very earliest stage that environmentalism was a fascist policy. It used the argument that we have to clean the streams and the air and that we have to preserve nature to impose depopulation. And the argument essentially goes back to the idea that man is the problem. Alexander King, one of the founders of the Club of Rome, which was one of the most important of these institutions that grew up in the mid-60s, he said the enemy of the human race is human beings. You heard that from Schwab. Schwab said the desire, let me just repeat this again, the desire to create a better future for oneself is what's destroying the livability of our planet. So what does that leave you with? That you're supposed to not have a desire to be better, to do more, to accomplish something with your life? Because that's what they're saying. Be nothing more than a peasant who does the same thing that the previous 20 generations in your family did. Now, when you say that that's fascism, that population reduction, that Shaktian policy, as I went through and as Lynn went through in the debate with Lerner about who Schacht was. Schacht was an operative of the Western banks who was part of a process of using Germany for British geopolitical purposes to destroy the Soviet Union and to prevent any possibility for an economic future in Europe that was not controlled by the City of London. That was the whole purpose of the Hitler Project. The getting rid of all the world's Jews, these kinds of things. That was not the central feature of Nazism. It was the destruction of human civilization, organized by people in Britain, the United Kingdom, who are oligarchs, who believe that they're inherently better because of their racial purity. So, when you look at this question of calling Nazis Nazis, well, unless they're wearing swastikas and speak German and lived in between 1933 and 1945, you can't do that. Well, what was the pledge at Nuremberg? Never again. It was not against Germans, it was against the depopulation policy. And what Lyndon LaRouche showed is that this is a continued intent of a section of the British ruling class that pushed eugenics, the idea of racial inferiority of certain groups, that used that as a policy matter. That today says there are some people who are useless eaters, not worth keeping alive, like the children of Afghanistan, the children of Yemen, the children of Syria. Let them go. We don't need them. The old people around the world, let them die off from COVID so that there'll be more room for those who are left. More room, Lebensraum. That was Nazi policy. And so when Lyndon LaRouche says that, you're breaking the taboo. You're not supposed to say such things. When you point out that the British were behind Russiagate, well, for the longest time, people said, well, isn't it possible Trump really was working with Putin? Well, we've waged big fights on these issues, and we've been called extremists. We've been called all sorts of things. But as you said at the very beginning, you speak truth to power. You have the courage, the way Lyndon LaRouche did, to tell the truth and fight for the truth and fight for the other person to understand that they've been misled, that they've been fed a false narrative. Now, more and more people are beginning to realize that. The problem is they don't know, they pick up a piece here or a piece there, and they tend to fit it in with what they believe already, as opposed to recognizing that you have to get outside of the bubble. You have to think outside of the axioms that you have. And that's what's really frightening. I mean, a lot of people who like what we're saying and say, well, I don't want to join an organization that's so discredited on the internet. That's not really what their biggest problem is, because if they knew we were right, they wouldn't give a damn what Google says or what's in Wikipedia. If they really believed what we were writing about the human being as a creative image, or creative being in the image and likeness of the Creator, who has a responsibility to develop the planet, and they were really committed to that, why would they care what Eric Schmidt or Facebook or Yahoo or any of these others say about their organization? You fight for the truth. But the problem is that people don't necessarily agree that they want to go into that and take that task on. And that's why they're susceptible to social media, susceptible to the pleasures of video games and pornography, because it's much easier than fighting for the truth. And then you look at what was done to Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon LaRouche, as Ramsey Clark and others have said, was made an example. The same way Julian Assange is being made an example. If you fight for the truth, we can destroy you. Well, if enough of us fight for the truth, we're the majority. And I think that's, for those people just coming around now, when you see this in Wikipedia or Google or the slanders, just recognize that this is people who are defending a bankrupt world order that thinks that you're a peasant and should live as a slave. And that if you agree with that, then fine, accept Google and Wikipedia. But I think if people have that put to them in an empathetic way, that you can function as a creative being and change the circumstances of history, the way Lyndon LaRouche has, then it becomes more enticing to get into the fight, and then you start laughing at the idiocy of our enemies.
Okay, here's an interesting question. This is from the South. I'll put it like that. And this says we're trying to create a deliberative dialogue around the vaccine matter. We are personally opposed to the vaccine, but we are also thinkers. We know that the lack of health care is and lack of hospitals and doctors is a more fundamental matter than the particulars of the vaccine. But we cannot trust the pharmaceutical companies. And LaRouche in the 1980s questioned AIDS very clearly. So how do we go about, and how should there be a discussion about this matter that stays away from name calling and finger pointing?
Well, there are a couple ways to approach this. One is, much of what is being written about how bad the vaccine is coming from people who are not virologists, who have not studied and been involved for a long time in this history of taking on viruses. I just was listening to a discussion the other day where they were saying that there have been people working on vaccines to counter these kinds of SARS-type illnesses, working on it for 25 years. And so the argument you hear on the internet, well, this was a snap done, it was done overnight, but it was done by people who have had a long history in this. And I find it ironic that much of the anti-vax policy comes from people who are supporters of Donald Trump, when Trump was the person who legitimately and courageously fought to get a vaccine out. Now, why is it necessary to have a vaccine? I mean, it's becoming clear that of the people who are dying today around the world, the vast majority of them are people who are not vaccinated. Now, you can go on the internet and find a story. on something like Forbidden Knowledge or some of these websites that will tell you that there were 25,000 people who died last week in Europe from the vaccine. And what they're correlating is the numbers of deaths and how many of those people had vaccines. There's no correlation that the vaccine caused the death, but you have people who are coming forward putting these things out. Now, since I'm not a virologist or a vaccine expert, I tend to take a slightly different approach to it. If you want to kill off the human race, create skepticism about science. Now, some people say, well, but what about global warming? They say the science is there to prove global warming. No, the science is not there. That is an imposed top-down ideology. But when it comes to the history of vaccines and how vaccines work, and to the fact that you have the spread of this disease largely among the unvaccinated, that's a fact. That's not an ideology. And I think the problem is that this just shows the extent to which the breaking down of people's trust in institutions and government is a tool in the hands of the enemy. That is, if you can convince people that there's no way to stop this, or convince people that it's not a serious illness, and that the people who are dying of COVID are really dying of heart attacks. If you can spread enough disinformation, you can get people to buy almost any line. The thing you have to look at is why this became such a problem. And it was the breakdown of the trust in government, and for good reason, because one of the aspects of the government policy has been to destroy the public health system. Lynn mentioned that in that Austin speech, that the Hill-Burton Act and the number of hospitals and the trained medical professionals have gone way down in the last 40 years. We no longer have the healthcare infrastructure. And what's replacing it? Websites telling you what are the natural cures. Now, some of these are fine. So nutrition is a good thing. But when you come up against something that is a proven killer, and such as the pandemic, it's not necessarily the case that sucking on 500 lemons in a day is going to cure you. So I think, and I know I'll take a lot of flack for saying that, but this is where you have to look at the fact that if you wanted to conduct a genocidal experiment, convince people that there's no antidote to a disease.
I want to take the opportunity, actually, Harley, for you to take up something. Again, you referenced, of course, Ava Lerner and Lynn's opposition to him, but Lynn LaRouche often talked about his opposition to Norbert Wiener. We have a quote from him, which you're going to put up and just read here. It is quite conceivable that life belongs to a limited stretch of time, and that the time may well come when the Earth is again a lifeless, burnt out, or frozen planet. It is a foregone conclusion that the lucky accident which permits the continuation of life in any form on Earth, on this Earth, even without restricting life to something like human life, is bound to come to a complete and disastrous end. In a very real sense, we are shipwrecked passengers on a doomed planet. We shall go down, but let it be in a manner to which we may look forward as worthy of our dignity. Now,
that sounds like one of the early statements of death with dignity, huh?
Yeah, so I mean, you might want to tell people like who Norbert Wiener was, why, Lynn, and because I was just reminded when you were answering that this might be a good interpretation.
Well, you actually know more about him than I do. What I know is what I've learned from Lynn is that the development of systems analysis and the method of approach of Wiener and von Neumann and others was that the field of mathematics is the highest form of science, that science, that philosophy and philosophical inquiry is subordinate to the analytical processes that they developed, that went into the development of the computer, And more importantly, what was evident in that statement, that there's nothing unique about human life. That what we're doing is engaging in an Aristotelian process of just categorizing dynamics that we can see, as opposed to hypothesizing what's going on in the world that we don't see. And Lyndon LaRouche's philosophical heroes were the people such as Kepler and Leibniz and Leonardo da Vinci, who tried to make the invisible become visible by using hypotheses to figure out how things work, as opposed to saying, well, if we can't come up with a logical point by point empirical verification, it doesn't exist. And the question of life is one of those things. How do you empirically verify life other than looking at what man has done to transform this planet so that it can hold over 7 billion people? According to the statistical methods of Wiener and von Neumann, we never should have had more than maybe 1 billion people on the planet, maybe only a few 100,000. So I think this is where Lynn took the polemic of fighting these guys. He once said that the greatest killers are those who practice systems analysis. But Dennis, you may want to say something more on this.
No, I actually think that was fine. I don't want to add anything, actually, because also we have a couple more questions. We're going to put these two questions together because you've actually already dealt with one of them, and it was this: great economic progress was made under presidencies. I'm sorry, this is the question. I'm sorry. The question you've already partially answered is from St. Louis. My question is, with a hyperinflation as a possibility on the table with our government, whenever our debt ceiling is raised, the money printed never goes to the current rotting structure of our economy. If the debt ceiling is raised, what will this mean for our current infrastructure, such as agriculture, our transportation system, and not to mention the attack on our energy sources? That was that question. But here's the other one, which I was also reading earlier. Great economic progress was made under presidencies such as Franklin Roosevelt that practiced what was called the American system. Could you discuss how and why LaRouche's approach is now required to take us beyond those policies, especially in light of the changes in the world in the last 100 years?
That's a tough question. I mean, the first one on the debt ceiling, it's fairly obvious that, as I said earlier, you're not solving a problem by printing money to cover debt. You know, it's like paying a mortgage on a credit card. You're just increasing the total volume of debt without increasing the ability to pay for it. So that's fairly obvious. And you know, the real problem in the Congress is that they're fighting false paradoxes. You know, the paradox is not either you default on the debt or you raise the debt ceiling. It's you figure out how to make the economy more productive. And you can always restructure debt, but if you do something that destroys the productive side of the economy, the actual value added through the productive processes, you never get out of debt. Now, the question on LaRouche's four laws, what is added, I think in a sense, what he argued is that most of it is there in the Hamilton policy, the Hamiltonian credit. Hamilton was a great believer in infrastructure, and also his Society for Useful Manufactures, one of his reports to the Congress, was essentially how you increase productivity through scientific applications of new technologies, scientific discovery. What I would say Lynn is adding is looking at the whole question of the processes of life and bringing in the work of Vladimir Vernadsky and this question to the noosphere. What is the source of improvements? And it's not tinkering, it's creative discoveries. It's the development of the human mind as a physical force in the universe. That is, ideas as a physical force, that you're taking something which exists, a dead planet, you know, in terms of elements that are there, with living processes acting on the antibiotic. But then there's something higher. There's the human creative mentation. which figures out how to use processes in the biotic and the abiotic spheres to increase the capacity of man to advance. And this, I would argue, is implicit in the four laws, but it's worthy of its own individual pursuit. You know, this was the discussion, the dialogue LaRouche was having with the top scientists of Russia, people in Italy, people all over the world. And this is the kind of discussion which really should be taking place now. And that's why the space project is so important. You know, and I think it was, what was it, 1988, LaRouche did this campaign advertisement, The Woman on Mars. Was it 84 or 88? You probably remember. But it was about the 88. It was about the importance of getting outside of the Earth's environment into the extraterrestrial world to be able to have a better capacity of viewing what other processes are shaping life on our planet. And we see this now in terms of the foolishness of the so-called Green New Deal, which basically says that cows farting and automobiles driving is what's causing climate change, when in fact they leave out what scientists have always known as the main cause of climate change, which is solar radiation and changes in the atmosphere, above the atmosphere, related to planetary motion, positions of the galaxy, and so on. Well, to get outside of our own atmosphere, to set up observation points, including human observation points on other planets, opens the door to enlarging our knowledge of this process of human creativity transforming the biosphere. And so I would say that's probably what LaRouche added most importantly. But I think you find if people really study the four laws, you'll see that he's put in it the means by which we can break the back of hyperinflation and, more importantly, break the back of the financial oligarchy and do it on a worldwide basis. That's probably the other point. Hamilton doesn't talk about the global implications, at least in his reports to the Congress, but Franklin and Hamilton and others were very much focused on the possibility of the American system transforming the rest of the world. And Hamilton himself was very interested in how the United States could aid the process of development in Haiti.
Yeah, I'll just mention that in terms of the what you were asking about the woman on Mars, to be precise for everybody who wants to know, it was for the 1988 campaign. It was actually recorded during the late summer, early fall of 1987, and I remember it because I was with Lyndon LaRouche at the time. He was his associate Alan Salisbury, now deceased, is a very close friend of mine, and that begins with a scientific problem, just in terms of what you're proposing. Is at the very beginning of that broadcast, generally thought about as being sort of just a graphic. But what happens is that there's a graphic of the planetary system, and then there are some notes played, which are the tones of the planetary system, or at least the way in which we chose to illustrate Kepler's conception of the planetary system. And then what happens is that the beginning of Mozart's Dissonance Quartet is played. And so there's a question that has been posed by LaRouche, which most never think to investigate at the very beginning of that piece. And I just wanted to make sure I told this to people, because some of the musicians who are out there in particular, as well as some of the scientists, might want to investigate that question that he's posing to everyone at the very beginning. He doesn't talk about it, he just does it, and it's posed from the very beginning. So that's just for anybody that wants to look up The Woman on Mars and take a look at the first 3 minutes and wonder what we're even referring to. So I just wanted to mention that. We actually want to show here, sort of as we draw to conclusion, a final portion from that 1996 discussion, which I believe Harley was probably at, actually. And it's LaRouche discussing, LaRouche discussing his idea of the importance of what he called the flanking maneuver or the flank in the mind. And so we're going to play that and then let Harley respond to what he sees.
In 1793, France was a mess. They had a bunch of baby boomers, Robespierre and so forth, making a mess of the place. And the invading armies were chopping the country up, about to overrun it, defeat all the French troops, and carve the country up into several pieces. So Paris government was desperate, and so they picked a genius they didn't like. It meant that if he lost the war, he'd get guillotined. By the name of Lazare Carnot, who happened to be a military genius as well as a scientific genius. And they put him in charge of French defenses. Well, the first thing he did was to change the way war was fought. He made a revolution in warfare. He changed mass mobile field artillery, all kinds of things, changes in the technology of war. Because he was a scientist, he had many friends who were the leading scientists of France. He rallied them. They started whole new industries, and within 2 years, revolutionized warfare under those conditions and won the war. Now, a number of things he did. One thing he said, look, he told Paris they didn't know how to fight war because they were running a baby boomer war. They had the baby boomers who were scattered all over the place, each doing their own thing against the opposing troops, and they're losing, like baby boomers do lose. That's why I worry about our government. It's not just the politics of the government, it's the baby boomers who are in charge. They're bound to make a mess of it. You know them, they're your children. And you know the problems you had in raising them. Anyway, so what he did is he said, you have to take your forces, and you have to do, in effect, what he said, what Alexander the Great did to the great Persian horde, and what Hannibal did to the Romans at Cannae. Even in face of superior force, if you can catch the superior force stumbling over its own feet or causing it to stumble over its feet, you can defeat it, even with an inferior force. Of course, in those days, cavalry was rather popular for that. Alexander had an army of about 75,000 people. He came with this vast horde outside of Arbela on the plains of Gaugamela. And with his cavalry attacks, he just hounded that thing till they began running into each other. And this vast horde of 1 million Persians, of mixed auxiliaries and volunteers and whatnot, were just scattered. And the Persian Empire was destroyed by about 75,000 Macedonians and Greeks. Yeah? Similarly, that when Hannibal faced a superior Roman force at Cannae, the Roman force was so tightly packed that the superiority of its firepower for the nature of the times, it couldn't bring it to bear. So you had an overwhelming force coming at you, but they were all tangled up, closely packed, so they could not deploy their firepower against attack. So what he did, he said the cavalry attacked the thing on the ends. He put his best troops in front to hold the Roman horde back, Roman legions back, and then sent the cavalry around both ends to attack it on the flanks. That's pretty much what Sherman did to Joe Johnson in Alabama and Georgia in the famous period during the Civil War. He just flanked them all over the place, even though Joe Johnson had a superior military force in terms of numbers and so forth. Sherman outwitted him by hitting him constantly on the flanks. It was a principle of military science which comes from the experience famously in military science from Alexander the Great and Hannibal. So what Carnot insisted is you had to concentrate your force on a few selected targets. Don't get tangled up with macho and say, well, we've got to attack this one, we've got to attack this one, we've got to show our macho here, we've got to show our macho here, we've got to show the enemy we're taking him on everywhere. That's the way to lose a war. You concentrate on a flank. It's what the cavalry used to do it. Then in World War II, tank attacks and special reconnaissance forces would do it. Move in, hit hard with full force on some flanking point, and you disrupt the entire structure of the enemy's force, his ability to deploy.
Now, Harley, at the point that he was discussing this, in specific, he was discussing the 1996 election, and he was discussing the issue of having a very small percentage of the vote that you took away from certain candidates, other things. But I thought it would be important for you to say something about both what that situation was, but also in looking at the present global circumstance. You got so many different things, but there has to be a concentration of our force, of our firepower. And I think the question is, why is what we're doing, especially, for example, around the Green New Deal or certain things, but why this idea that Lynn is saying here about this flanking process? How come this is the right way to do it?
Well, I don't know if it was at that particular presentation or one before or after, but he said the principle of the flank is you hit the enemy on a flank they don't know they have. That your enemy thinks their forces are arrayed, like Schwab today, the Great Reset, and so on, and you find an area where they don't expect it because they can't think creatively. Now, as he was speaking, what occurred to me is the principle of the flank for today. Take this question of the Thucydides trap. The idea that historically you have a constant trend in which one great power starts to decline and another one comes up, and they always end up in a war. And how do we avoid that war? Or how do you win that war? Now, what we've just seen in Afghanistan tells us that in the small wars, there's no military solution unless you completely obliterate the country, which we've tried to do in several cases. Or in a bigger war, you end up with the danger of a thermonuclear annihilation of the human race. So where's the flank if we're going to compete with China, if we're going to take on China? Well, this is where we ought to think about what Xi Jinping means when he says a win-win option. Suppose the United States were to say to China, instead of opposing the Belt and Road Initiative with all the phony attacks that are coming from the very same people who are pushing the Great Reset, the Chinese are not going to go with the Great Reset. They're not going to go with the Green New Deal. Why not join them? That's the flank against the international oligarchy. If the United States would join with Russia and China and say, okay, let's take Afghanistan reconstruction as a test case. If we can work together to do some good, if we can find mutual benefit for our country, your country, and a third country through reconstruction, through bringing in the Belt and Road Initiative, instead of trying to stop it. What's the benefit of stopping China and other neighbors of Afghanistan from trying to modernize Afghanistan? That we have to have revenge against the Taliban? What about the millions of children there? But what if we were to say to China, okay, we're in, we want to work on it, and said to the Chinese, here are some American corporations that are willing to participate in building these corridors of development, whether it's transportation, whether it's power systems, water management. We want to work with you on that, and we'll also help you generate the credit for this, because right now, the money we give to the International Monetary Fund does nothing to help any country. But we see that what you're investing is actually producing something. Well, that's a flank. Now, that would anger completely the anti-China crowd that's been trying to convince the American people that China is our enemy, that China is an aggressive country, that China is tormenting and torturing Muslims in Xinjiang province and shutting down freedom in Hong Kong and so on. But they don't know what's going on in China. And in fact, you talk to people like Bill Binney and Snowden, they'll tell you that the so-called social control system in China is modeled on what was implemented in the United States under the Patriot Act. So what if we give up these ideologies and say, let's work together. Let's rebuild Afghanistan. Let's show that the human race can take on these challenges. I think that's the kind of flank that Lyndon LaRouche would be very happy with.
Okay, well, I thank you very much, Harley, and I want to just point out again to people that our pamphlet, which is available for you, The Coming U.S. Economic Miracle on the New Silk Road. We want you to get in touch with us, get copies of it, begin to deploy it, and work with us to make sure that it is becomes, if you will, the primary topic of discussion in the United States about how to outflank our otherwise doomed march into oblivion, no matter what administration you seem to have there. So I think if you have any other things to add, Harley, anything that we've missed, you think we've covered it all?
No, just people should join me every morning when I do my morning update. I usually keep that short to 10 minutes. But Monday through Friday at the LaRouche organization, you can get my daily update.
Okay, so on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank everybody who's joined us here today. We want to thank all of you who are about to get to work, getting that pamphlet out, and we'll see you here next week.